like to welcome the Prime Minister for the first constructive of the debate. Please not exceeding 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Speaker of the House, audience, as well as my partner in the opposition team for being here today. All right, let's get started. So, the resolution we received today was that the House would legalize prostitution. Now let's move into the resolutional analysis. First off, the definitions. Now, this House we are going to define as the United States federal government, or the USFG. Secondly, prostitution and legalizing it will be defined as prima facie, and so we'll just move on from there. So the thesis for this round is going to end up being the United States federal government should legalize prostitution. The case type will be a policy, and so this will be a policy round, and we'll be weighing, the weigh mechanisms will be net benefits on balance for the people living in the United States. So, significance. The harms of prostitution in the status quo are incredible. The first harm that we have here is talking about how currently, because prostitution is illegal, people who are victims of prostitution, ergo the actual sex workers, have no sort of legal representation or way to go justify or protect themselves in these situations. According to the State Department, about 80% of the workers are women, and about 30 to 50% are minority workers. And there are millions of these workers within the United States right now. The problem is that majority are used for sexual exploitation when people are human trafficked into the US. The massive impact of this is the exploitation of those millions of people, additionally leading to suicide deaths within the area. And it's the equivalent of modern slavery. So there's a dramatic decrease in the quality of life when people are going in these sorts of situations. The second harm is that STIs, or sexually transmitted infections, grow at a much rapider pace when prostitution is not regulated. The problem is, it's illegal right now. But our actual data for this point is based off the US National Library of Medicine, that illegal services have about 36% rate of STIs spreading throughout them. Underneath regulated brothels, it's generally closer to around 7%. So the massive impact of this is you'll be reducing lifelong illnesses that are run rampant throughout these sorts of communities when they are unregulated. The inherency of this round, or the reason why we are stuck in this place, is a structural barrier. And that structural barrier is the fact that it is legal within the United States and there's no form of regulation in the status quo. Plan. The plan is to legalize prostitution. Now this is going to include social protections, sexual protections, all the different necessary regulations within this piece of legislature, as well as STI testing and updating age and tax policy when it comes to this, to make sure we run this in an equitable and ethical manner. The agent of action is going to be Congress. The agent of enforcement is going to be Health and Human Services. The timeline will be as soon as possible, and the funding will be through normal means, seeing as how this will actually be able to pay for itself and more. First off, let's jump into our advantages now. Advantage 1 is this is going to dramatically shrink the black market. The link to this is that the plan now provides a legal way to go have sort of representation within our system, that these sorts of prostitutional practices are now going to be legal. And the problem is, when it's not legal, it's still done anyways, right? So the data for this is that this is likely to occur, the black market shrinking is likely to occur because under US law, it's illegal right now, so obviously, but this leads to raids and conflicts between police and other different groups, competing gangs and things like that. And so how much more effective would it be? We're creating an incentive system whereby now people don't have to worry about that sort of violence within these situations, and all they have to pay for is a minor tax. And so the impacts of this are dramatic. First off, it's going to increase the working environment standards. So when people go in there, they're not going to be treated like slaves when they're in this sort of occupation. And if they are a sex worker, they'll be doing it willingly, and they will have ways to exit the system if they are currently in it. But also, by bringing down the black markets, you will then be able to go stop sort of the violence that's happening in there and the abuse of the women who are in these situations. They can be beaten. They are treated far better because they are allowed to use sexual protections within these sorts of situations, effectively protecting against STIs like we talked about earlier. Secondly, violence is going to dramatically decrease, and that's the second impact. The reason why this is going to happen is that those gangs and police forces that currently run rampant with violence between these sorts of things, as does any sort of illegal activity, Without a justice system, it just ends in violence. Now, we have a justice system that we can go through these sorts of processes and protect people via that instead of individual groups getting violent with each other. Third impact is that this is going to end the use of minors within these sorts of groups, within prostitution. Currently, like I said, about 30 to 50% are minorities who are working within these minors who are working within this industry. And so by setting an age requirement for this and eliminating the black market to a great extent or completely, you are now going to stop the use of children who, at the early age of 14, can enter into these sorts of systems and, unprovoked, forced to go into sexual exploitation towards these practices. Our second major impact is going to be social services funding. So the link is that this program is going to self-fund itself. We talked about how we're going to reform tax code to be able to institute this for service taxes and things like that. Through that, we'll be able to pay for different programs within this. And they have dramatic external benefits to this plan through that. What we're looking at is a massive tax increase for social programs. So we're looking at the impacts of this is that we're getting about $20,000 per sex worker on average, and about $20 billion per year it's been estimated. So what we can do with that sort of money is pay for these medical checks, allow healthcare access for these women, and allow them to effectively use healthcare. Currently, right now, it's sort of whatever you pay for, you can get for it. So they don't necessarily have to go use condoms. They don't necessarily have to go use those sorts of other things within these sorts of black markets. But as soon as you start paying for these social services, you allow them better access to that, and they can actually pay for that. So today, we looked at this case through the lens of net benefits. We looked at it in a policy round, and we talked about, and so the reason why you'll be voting for this policy, and you'll be passing it, therefore we're voting for the government team, is because we've shown all these different impacts and how this will affect the livelihood of a practice that's already here, that we aren't stopping in the status quo. However, we are making it more effective. Thank you for your time, and you'll be voting for Go.
And now welcoming the Leader of the Opposition for their first constructive not to exceed 8 minutes.
Okay, so we're going to start with a quick round of thank yous. Thank you to the government for setting up that case so we can have this debate. Thank you for the audience to being here, supporting this event, and thank you to the judge for being here and taking time out of your day to judge this debate. Okay, so we're going to start off case and then go on case. We're going to have 2 off case positions today, a topicality and a disadvantage, before moving on case to refute some points. So starting off case, starting with the topicality, our interpretation is this should have been net benefits for the whole world rather than just the United States. Our violations is this is taking away from the op using how this policy would affect the entire world at large, because the United States is a global force and anything they do has worldwide implications. So our standards are going to be grounds. We are losing the grounds to talk about how this affects the world at large and not only just the United States. And it's going to be less educational because we can't discuss how this policy would affect how the world at large would be affected. So our voter is going to be an a priori issue, meaning that you'll be voting on this before anything else that happens in this round. And if you agree with our topicality, that alone is enough for us to win this round. So for that reason, on this topicality, you'll be voting op because they have clearly taken away grounds from the op. Moving on to our disadvantage, tagline, increased human trafficking. So our claim is going to be legalizing prostitution leads to an increase in human trafficking. The data for this is going to be the journal World Development, where out of 150 nations observed that legalized prostitution, all of them had some amount of increase in human trafficking after this policy passed. So that is where our disadvantage links into their plan, because they are legalizing prostitution, which will, by the data we cited, increase prostitution or increase human trafficking. Our brink is going to be the decrease to accessing a market leads to an increase in the market. So our impact for this will be people will be trafficked here because it is now an easier market to access. And when people are trafficked, it's truly, what's up?
Yeah, point of information. So when you say it increased human trafficking in each of these individual countries, so was that an absolute increase in human trafficking in other countries? Like, were there more people being trafficked overall in the world? or was it just within that one country at a time?
Most trafficking is done internationally, so I would believe that it means that there is more people being trafficked into. In fact, I believe the data actually stated that people are trafficked into these legal countries at a much higher rate than out of. So moving back to our impacts. People being trafficked are put in terrible situations. People are put in storage containers on boats and so where it gets very hot and very cold at night, and people die. Could you imagine being in a storage container where the person next to you literally has died 3 days ago and there's still 2 weeks till you reach your destination? That is the reality for people being trafficked. And by legalizing prostitution and increasing human trafficking, you are forcing more people into that situation in order for them to have access to the new market that the US has created. Additionally, while you might see a small decrease in the black market within the United States, as the government said, in the aggregate, black market activity would actually drastically increase because now there's a whole new, easily accessible market available in the United States where they can flood with trafficked individuals, as that's what happens. There's a large increase in inflow to nations with legal prostitution. So now moving on case. We're going to accept their significance, but we're going to, and their inherency, we accept their definitions except for their weighing mechanism. And we're going to discuss the plan really quick. So their plan is to legalize prostitution and tax it. Now this is kind of a touchy subject because basically what you're doing is you're changing who's benefiting from this to pimps or any kind of human trafficking ring to the government. So what we're doing is we're taking people who are already marginalized and oppressed and changing it so that now the government is directly marginalizing and oppressing these people and profiting from it. And that is a very morally shaky position to take for the US government. Additionally, moving down the plan, we were not given any solvency for this round. The government, while giving a plan and inherency and advantages to their plan, failed to tell us why their plan would be advantageous or would solve for the problem. They just simply gave a plan and gave advantages to the plan. So we don't even know if this plan actually solves for what they're saying it solves for, because it was never given to us. Moving on to refute their advantages, their first advantage was it would dramatically shrink the black market. And as we stated in the disadvantage, this is actually not true. So we're going to go ahead and take out this disadvantage, or this advantage. Because as we've already stated, access to new markets would lead to a dramatic increase in the black market activity flowing into the United States. So while the black market in the United States for human trafficking outward might decrease, it would drastically increase the increase. So this would not dramatically shrink the black market or shrink it at all. It would actively increase it. Moving on to their second advantage, social service programs. This, once again, as we stated in the plan, is a very shaky position to take as the US government. Because according to a recent government report, 90% of prostitutes don't want to be prostitutes. So all this plan is doing is normalizing and increasing what would be the social acceptability of being a prostitute, but not actually assisting prostitutes who don't want to be in this position anymore. We're not giving them any access to greater education. We're not giving them any access to any kind of reasonable movement out of the prostitution field. So we're forcing a marginalized group to stay marginalized with this plan by only giving them access to services which help them stay prostitutes, which, as the government report already stated, they don't want to be. So it's taking advantage, once again, of a marginalized group of people, and that's all this plan is doing. And so, for those two reasons, as we've stated, that their plan is already based on morally shaky ground. We weren't given any solvency for this, so we don't know if this plan actually solves what they claim it solves. And the fact that their advantages, number one, the first one doesn't even happen. We've already discussed that. Black market increases. And for the second advantage, the fact that most people don't want to be prostitutes, and this plan is only perpetuating a negative social stigma or a negative social position for these individuals, that you would have no choice but to vote for opposition today, because The government has clearly not reached their burden of proof, and net benefits clearly weighs on the side of the opposition. Also, because the round started inherently non-topical. So for those reasons, you'll be voting for the opposition today.
And please welcome the member of government for another constructive not to exceed 8 minutes.
All right, let's get started. Big round of thanks to everyone for being here again today. Let's jump into the off case, and then we'll move on case. Thanks again for the LO for bringing that and the judge for being here today and spending your time on this. So first off on the T, the real problem here is that the government has the right to define, and we really haven't been abusive in this round today, Judge. When you're looking at this, their violation is essentially that they would have rather this had been net benefits for the world as opposed to just the US. But remember, they didn't run a T on the actual actor. We define this house as the United States. So it only makes sense to define the impacts of this within the United States. I get that they're a world actor, but then that becomes incredibly speculative. The further down the line, it becomes incredibly vague, as we'll talk about in our standards. So their only standard in this is grounds, and that's shaky is best. That ground standard is on shaky ground. Okay, so for our counter standards for this is that context. So first off, we're talking about the United States, and they pose no different arguments towards the United States. So obviously, contextually, when it comes to standards, it makes sense for us to only talk about the net benefits of the United States. Secondly, clarity, that we're making these speculative global arguments, but even their data points didn't talk about the global impacts on, say, Southeast Asia or on Algeria, and how that would affect the amount of people coming out of those countries. All it talked about was internally within these countries, human traffic members were found more often. And that's probably understandable because now the options are more legal, so they're able to see these sorts of things instead of happening behind the scenes. So that's why you'll see that this is fairness argument and the education argument, both sort of fall through when it comes to voters. So you won't be voting on this today, Judge, because we've clearly shown the government has the right to define, and they haven't proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the government has been abusive or unfair or uneducational through the defining this strictly within the US borders. Moving on to DA1, so that it leads to increased human trafficking. Hit up that data points, talking about the Journal of World Development again, how that increases human trafficking. It doesn't have any sort of linkage to other countries and actual absolute numbers of people trafficked. Additionally, second argument, talking about how in these countries, it's going to be more likely to be reported, but that doesn't, when it's legal at least, it's more likely to be reported. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual number of people who are being trafficked actually increases. This is an incredibly vague statement, and therefore they're not really showing that sort of Brink scenario there. They're not really showing the threshold of which we know that this is actually increasing within these countries, nor do we know the extent in which it's increasing in these countries. It could just be a reporting error, but that's not really explained out very well. Additionally, so look at the link in this plan, that the plan increases prostitution, and so they're saying that then makes it easier for people to come into the country. Once again, our agent of enforcement in this is the Health and Human Services Committee, not Border Patrol, not any sort of group that would decrease the restrictions of people trafficked in the US. The definition of human trafficking is people crossing borders illegally, like moving people across those borders. This has no effect on that. All this changes is that within the US, people who are actively involved in this now have legal recourse to be able to go fight the system, to be able to, not necessarily even the system, to be able to get out of the black markets and into regulated brothels or areas such as that. And so the plan doesn't actually change laws on human trafficking, borders, etc. So therefore, this plan falls through on the link and the data. So you really don't hit any of those advantages, any of those impacts on this about public safety, about decreasing the demand for use in trafficking. Increases the actual people showing up here. You really don't hit any of those because it falls apart from the very start. Now let's move on case at some of their refutation. So on case, the first thing that they attacked was the moral hazards of taxing a service. We tax a lot of services here in the US. We tax any company with service taxes. It's like 8% here in California. And the government does that everywhere. Income taxes, things like that, That's what we're talking about here. But then we're also going to have a specific tax where we're talking about being able to fund these social securities programs. I mean, sorry, not social security, social services programs. So what we're not acting like is the government is not then becoming the pimp of America. Like, that's not what's going on right here. What's going on right here is that we're now empowering people to have health care and having these sorts of ways to go check for like STI checks and sexual protection when they're within these acts. Yeah, what's the question?
So is taking advantage of a marginalized group of people not a morally questionable standpoint?
So they're being taken advantage right now, right? They're being taken advantage within these black markets. And so by bringing them into the legal markets, since we're weighing this on net benefits, we're helping more people in the round. This isn't a deontological case of whether an action is wrong or right. What we're really asking is how many people can we help with this plan? And we're going to help more plans, and it obviously helps more. And if there's a little bit of a tax involved, I don't think that necessarily makes the government into a demonized entity. Far less so, because we're decreasing the violence, we're increasing working standards, all of which are things he never addressed in his actual LO speech. And so that's why you can really take out that argument of that the tax is attacking marginalized groups, because you're now allowing them ways to get out of that area if they don't want to be there, because they're not going to be killed for it and not going to be arrested for it. That's how our plan is there. Additionally, they said that we had no solvency. I clearly explained how harms 1 and 2 are connected and are solved. Additionally, the inherency is solved by this plan. Line by line, STIs. We talked about how there's going to be an health mandate. So allowing people to reduce the amount of STIs, and allowing this plan for allowing regulated brothels is specifically going to solve the unregulation at 36% rate down to at least the 7% rate within the countries that have done this before. Secondly, that they have legal recourse. The inherency barrier here was that it's illegal. We made it legal. That's the solvency. If there were really any questions, they could have been asked during that speech, but they weren't. And so we're just going to flow that through, talking about a solvency. Obviously, it's feasible. Obviously, it's desirable, because you're dramatically decreasing these sorts of harms to the people involved. Finally, we'll talk about the advantages of social services. So first off here, so we're talking about taking advantage of these sorts of legal services and things like that, that we're taking advantage of people when 90% of the world don't want it. That's fine. I mean, they accepted the RA that this is for net benefits for the total number of people in the world. And so that's going to flow through. Additionally, we're talking about, when we talk about increasing black markets. All right, so let's actually talk about tax assist one more time about morally hazardous. They have access to a legal code now. They have autonomy over their body. They can leave and go whenever they want. Additionally, they may have better pay in the past system because they weren't taxed for it, but now they have alternatives. Now they have ways to move forward. When they talk about how 90% of the people don't want it, now they have ways to get out of that. So that's why you'll be voting for the member of government today.
And welcoming the member of the opposition with their constructive not to exceed 8 minutes.
Okay, one quick round of thank yous again. Thank you, Judge, for being here to judge this debate. Thank you for the government, making my life a little bit harder. We're gonna just jump right into it. So we're gonna go off case, rebuild the T, rebuild the disadvantage before refuting their refutations. So once again, going off case with our T. So they responded to this by saying that they have the right to define, but the government does not have the right to define the case in a way that is inherently abusive to the opposition, which is what this weighing mechanism is. Because the US is such a strong global actor, anything they do in regards to hot topic policies have very reaching waves. The United States alone is one of the biggest hotspots for human trafficking. So any law created by the United States that would affect human trafficking would affect the world around, because we're just such a big actor in the world. So for that, they could say that they have the right to define this just the United States, but because of what I've just said, that is inherently abusive to the opposition, because we can't discuss the reaching impacts that every action that the United States takes will have. And that they clearly didn't didn't dive into the global problems, but we discussed global problems. We discussed how this will lead to human trafficking increasing inflow into the United States. It's not like they're trafficking people from Louisiana to California. They are taking people from other countries and trafficking them into America. And that is definitely a global issue, which should be discussed when it comes to net benefits for how this policy will affect people. So with this, you can see there was a clear abuse in the grounds for the opposition because we were defined in a way that we're not allowed to discuss the reaching impacts that this policy will have, where the government is so interested in only seeing 2 steps in front of their faces, when in reality, everything that the United States does can and will have reaching impacts. So for that, the T still stands because there has been clear abuse illustrated by these points. So for that, it's still an a priori issue, and you will still be voting opposition on T because there's clearly been an abuse, and that has clearly reduced the education to discuss how this policy will affect the entire world, because what the US does affects the entire world. Moving on to our disadvantage. Their refutation was they only talk about the countries internally. But again, the data point was people being trafficked into the country. They're not trafficked within their own country. Human trafficking flows into the country at a much higher rate when prostitution is legalized. So their point that there's no actual amounts or people are just more likely to report, that just doesn't stand because the data clearly shows that people are being flowed into countries with legal prostitution at a much higher rate than countries that have illegal prostitution. So the refutation that there's no numbers or maybe it's just more likely to be reported doesn't really stand. And additionally, a lot of their responses to this were speculative. So they themselves, after condemning speculation in their T refutation, continue to speculate a lot about any kind of disadvantage that might happen to this. What's up?
Doesn't that just reinforce the fact that these sorts of global impacts are speculative, and therefore reinforcing the T arguments?
No, because as the data point says, this is definitely flowing in from other countries. Human trafficking inflow, not human trafficking flowing within its own country. There is a definite increase in humans being trafficked into countries with legal prostitution, which is why the disadvantage stands, and which is why it leads to a net increase in black markets, because it's not like humans are coming from nowhere. Well, I guess in a very biological sense, humans do come from nowhere, but trafficked humans are coming from other countries and being placed into easily accessible markets that come from legal prostitution, which again, might not increase the black market in the country in question, or contextually in this case, the United States, but it leads to a huge increase in countries in other parts of the world because they need to take humans to flow into this newly accessible market, an easily accessible market due to easy prostitution laws. All right, moving on to their argument on a moving on case to their refutation of our claim that this is morally hazardous for the United States. The U.S. is they claim that we income tax, all right, and this will help more people being involved in prostitution, which income tax isn't inherently bad because most people work jobs that wouldn't be considered morally hazardous. But prostitution, as we stated down in our refutation of advantage 2, which I'll get to because they kind of dropped the ball on it, 90% of people don't want to be prostitutes. So we are taking people who don't want to do what they do and are generally forced into this position because they have nothing else that they can do, and then taking advantage of them actively. This is a huge issue. And because of that, it's just kind of negatively reflecting on the US government at large, which is not beneficial for the US government in the first place because now they're looked at negatively. And moving along to their refutation of our refutation of advantage 1, they just said that we didn't discuss any of their bottom points, which should flow through, but I took out the whole advantage because this doesn't decrease the black market. This will actually actively increase it on an aggregate scale across the world, which is again why it's so important that we discuss this on a global scale, because it's really easy to see how something good happens if you look at it in a very focused area. Like a CEO getting a raise is great for the CEO, except that they had to lay off 50 million people. net beneficial in a very concise contextual way, which is ultimately not a good stand to be in. And so yeah, that was basically their refutation of our refutation was just, yeah, no, it doesn't happen. And it does. It very actively happens. So the point still stands, and the advantage is still taken out. It leads to an increase in black market activity. Moving on to advantage 2, where all they said was that social services make it easy for prostitutes to leave and come and leave if they want to. But nowhere in their plan do they lay out how that's supposed to happen. They just said prostitutes can leave if they want to. Yeah, cool. Prostitution has a lot of transferable skills to most other jobs. And that's pretty much all they said, was that prostitutes can leave, or that it'll be easier for them to have access to legal recourse or something of that matter. But what their plan is trying to fight human trafficking, and that's currently unique. So that claim is, that currently is illegal, so that claim is non-unique. And again, the claim that prostitutes can just leave is in and of itself outrageous, because that's like saying, hey, you could just pack up and quit your job if you want, but it doesn't mean you're going to go instantly find another job. And again, prostitution doesn't have a lot of transferable skills. And all this plan does is normalize prostitution and makes marginalized people forced to stay in marginalized situations by increasing ease of access to it. So for all of these reasons, and the fact that their refutations don't stand, they are inherently abusive to the opposition in their defining, and the fact that our disadvantage definitely shows an increase in black market activity, you'll be voting for op.
Please welcome back the Leader of the Opposition for the first rebuttal of the debate, not to exceed 4 minutes.
Just a quick blanket of thank yous. Thank you everyone for being here. Let's just jump right into voters. So our first big voter is going to be the T. The T is an a priori issue, which means it should come first, because you'll be voting on this before anything else in this round. So the round was started with the resolution net benefits for the US. And it was countered with the topicality. This should affect the whole world, not just the United States, because the United States actions affect the entire world. And this stands because it is inherently abusive to take away the potential actions that come from the United States making such a policy such as this, especially when talking about human trafficking. So the standards, grounds, and education, where our grounds were taken away from us, talking about the reaching impacts on a global scale that United States policy has, and education where if we're not discussing those, we're not being educated on it. These still stand, and this round was inherently defined against the opposition, meaning that you'll still be voting on T for the opposition for this. Now moving on to our next voter. And the one big voter for every policy case, burden of proof. So let me walk you through why the government didn't meet their burden of proof and the opposition wins on presumption. So starting with advantage 1 and solvency, or disadvantage 1 and solvency. So our disadvantage clearly says that there is a net increase in black market activity around the world. This is not net beneficial for everyone. This isn't even net beneficial for the United States, because when more people are trafficked, it hurts people. That's not beneficial for people. This is additionally is a solvency press into the government's plan, because they're not solving for what they're saying they're solving. They say they solve for human trafficking and issues like that, but that does not happen. That is not something that comes from this plan that they're bringing forth. And so for that reason, their burden of proof is not met. They're actually this is actually a plan that actively will it'll be net detrimental for the world. Moving on to our next point, tax and normalization. So our response to their second advantage was that they're basically taxing people and taking advantage of them for people who don't actually want to be in the situation that they're already in. This is in effect normalizing prostitution and allowing the government to legitimately take advantage of a marginalized group of people. This, while maybe economically advantageous, is not in any way socially beneficial for the people. It in fact it hurts. It's a damaging aspect to the individuals because they will not have access or easy access out of prostitution because now it's been normalized. Society doesn't view them as a marginalized group of people when they're still very much from poor neighborhoods or from different countries entirely who are just trying to get by in the only way they know how. Because again, there are no transferable skills. So this is not net beneficial for prostitutes. It actually hurts them in a social area. And then moving on to their just advantage one, that's just wrong. As we clearly pointed out in our disadvantage, this does not lead to a decrease in the black market. In fact, on the aggregate, it leads to an increase because people need to be flooded into this new market in order for it to be successful. So for all of these reasons, the government has come nowhere close to meeting their burden of proof. And net benefits clearly sides on the opposition because this will be extremely detrimental for individuals. So for all of these reasons and the topicality, you'll be voting for the opposition today.
Last but not least, welcoming back the Prime Minister for the last speech of the debate. The final rebuttal not to exceed 5 minutes, please.
All right, this has been a fun debate. Let's jump right into the rebuttals. I want to thank everyone for being here today. And judge, audience, LO. All right, let's get started. So first, jumping on to the voters. So we're going to initially address their voters, refute them, and then we're going to jump back on case and talk about my voters for the case. So their first voter is the T. They're basically the only thing they talked about is that this ignores the rest of the world. As we talked about, though, initially we were discussing they didn't have a T on the fact this is the USFG. They had a T on the fact whether we were excluding the rest of the world or not. And we had arguments talking about how it can be very speculative, and that's where it sort of went, talking about reporting standards and whether it would be more so or less so based on these statistics. But what really is going to be persuasive for you, and without a doubt, reason you're going to be dropping this T, is because they dropped both of my counter standards within that case. So they dropped my counter standard of clarity, and they also dropped my counter standard of context. And they really didn't address either of those things, nor say that they were about to go, nor give any sort of meaningful refutation to them. So that's why you'll be dropping the T today. Additionally, because the government has the right to define and they haven't proved excessive amounts of abuse within this round because of it. Let's jump down to burden of proof arguments that they had. So the first one, talking about DA1 insolvency press, that this actually increases problems worldwide with all of these different things. But since you're dropping the T, remember, we're just talking about the United States in this. We're not interested in what happens with the rest of the world as it revolves to this, because that's unclear. We can't have a definite position, definite threshold at which point we're increasing it or decreasing it, or whether we know that it's just because of the United States changing this sorts of laws. So that's why you'll be dropping the DA one, both because it doesn't link in because of how we're weighing the debate, but also because we don't actually know if that's going to happen and they have to sort of show that. And we're not changing any sort of internal standards. We're not changing anything on the borders. We're not changing anything internally. The Health and Human Services is what's enforcing this. So there's going to be absolutely no change in the actual border integrity of our country. Number B, or the second one, when they talked about how tax and normalizing this practice and saying that they have no ability to leave. Well, now they can actually go charge people who have human rights abuses within this area. So either way, we're making it far better for the people who are within the system right now. And we're pushing them towards a safer practice of these sorts of things. And they aren't legally required to stay there, right? If they leave, they're not gonna be hunted down and killed. And that's how we're helping it within this round today. The third one is just saying that we're outright wrong in our advantage one, but that's ultimately dependent on their disadvantage. So remember, their only response to advantage one, where we talked about shrinking the black market, is that this has a net increase in human trafficking worldwide, which means we'll have more people within our country entering into the black market. But he never really attacked our link here, which specifically says that now that there's a legal way, it's way cheaper to just go towards that legal option, rather than operating illegally within our country. So either way, by taking out that barrier, if even one organization starts operating legally, then at that point we have shrunk the black market and we get access to the decrease in violence and justice. We get access to the increasing work standards and things like that. So let's move to our burden of proof. And it's going to be three main things. The fact that they dropped advantage two, The fact that everything depends on the DEA, and we took that out. And also, our case still stands. So Advantage 2, they completely dropped that. So they dropped everything talking about social services and how this is going to dramatically decrease STIs within the country and within these sorts of industries, and how these sorts of taxes are going to help fund autonomy and freedom for these people who are within these practices right now. So either way, prostitution is happening in the status quo. Right now we're giving them far better quality of life when that's happening. The second one, the case depends on the DA, and we've already talked about how we take that out. We've also taken out the T, so they have absolutely no link. So they're not coming forward with any serious disadvantages or unique disadvantages, and everything they're talking about is dependent on that. So that's our second voter. They really haven't shown any sort of offense within this round today. And our third one is case stance. So they didn't talk about our harms, they didn't talk about our inherency. They had somewhat of a solvency press, but now we've explained out how we give legal recourse, how either way, this is going to actually give the option of people of leaving, rather than the status quo where there's absolutely no hope and there's no way forward. So that's why you'll be voting for government team today, and that's how we fulfilled our burden of proof.